I think we should just jump right in and unpack
Let's
this.
do it. I am ready.
Awesome. We are back, and today we are, setting a bit of a vibe. We're lighting a candle, pouring a glass of wine, maybe a cheap Chianti, considering the era we are visiting, and stepping right into a time machine.
It really is a time machine.
Yeah, we are traveling back to March 30th, 1966. We are dropping in on a living room in Elmira, New York, where the air is thick with cigarette smoke and, well, something else entirely. Something electric.
It is a distinct pleasure to be back here with you, and you are right about the atmosphere. The space we are exploring today is quite literally electric.
Hmm.
We're looking at consciousness, telepathy, and the really strange, often humorous intersection of high metaphysics and daily domestic life.
Exactly. It is a total vibe, very relaxed, a little chilling, but mostly just really funny when you look at the contrast. We are analyzing session 246 of the Seth Material.
A fascinating session.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
But before we get into the high strangeness, and trust me, it gets very strange, I need to make sure everyone knows the ground rules for the show.
Right, the housekeeping.
Yeah. This deep dive is distributed free of charge on all major platforms for educational purposes. We are here to learn, to explore, and to question.
And we absolutely must give credit where credit is due. The source material for today's discussion comes directly from the early sessions, Book 6 of the Seth Material.
Yep.
And that is published by the New Awareness Network. If what we discuss today sparks your intellectual curiosity, which, as we will see, is actually a major theme of this specific session, we strongly encourage you to study the original books.
You really should.
You can find them and support the publishers by visiting the New Awareness Network website and bookstore at sethcenter.com for the early sessions.
Absolutely. Go buy the books. They look great on a shelf, and they will completely blow your mind. Okay, so let's set the scene for everyone listening. We are dropping in on Jane Roberts, who channels this entity known as Seth, and her husband Rob Butts. But this is not just a dry lecture from the great beyond, is it?
No, not at all. And I think that is exactly what makes Session 246 so compelling. Well, often, when people think of channeled material, they imagine these grand sermons from the Mount.
Right, like glowing robes and booming voices.
Exactly. Abstract philosophy that feels totally disconnected from our daily reality. But here, we have a session that is deeply embedded in the gritty, awkward, and funny reality of just being human.
I like to call it the chilling adventures of domesticity.
That is a perfect title. We have these profound pieces of advice on how to influence the younger generation and the literal nature of time itself, sitting right next to a frantic search for a lost board game piece
And dietary advice about citrus fruit,
yes, the citrus fruit.
which I love. It grounds the whole thing. So let's unpack this first part. The session starts with some context about these young visitors. Who are these people crashing the party in Elmira?
So Rob and Jane have these younger friends, Marilyn, Don, and Ann.
Okay.
They know them from Rob's workplace. These are young adults, probably in their 20s, and they've been coming over to hang out fairly regularly.
Just crashing on the couch.
Basically. They're curious about ESP and the channeling, sure, but Seth points out that something deeper is actually happening here. They aren't just there for the spooky stuff.
Right. They are there because they are fascinated by Rob and Jane's entire way of life.
Exactly. And Seth, speaking through Jane, drops this bomb of a compliment. Or maybe you could view it as a massive responsibility.
What does he say?
He says to Rob, "You have no idea, Joseph, of your effect upon the young people with whom you come in contact. Indeed, you are teaching them to think."
Wow. You were teaching them to think. That genuinely gave me chills when I read it.
It is a powerful statement.
Yeah.
Seth is highlighting a dynamic that I think many of us completely overlook in our own lives.
How so?
We tend to think of influence as something we do on purpose, like mentoring or coaching or parenting. You sit someone down and impart wisdom.
Right, like a formal arrangement.
But Seth is saying that the most profound influence comes from simply living your truth authentically in front of people. He notes that these young friends were denied certain developments in their earlier environments.
Meaning they didn't grow up with this kind of open-mindedness?
Correct. They didn't have access to this kind of intellectual freedom or artistic expression.
So Rod and Jane are basically the cool aunt and uncle, the ones who have all the weird books and the art supplies scattered around, and they stay up talking about philosophy until 2 in the morning.
That is the exact dynamic.
Yeah.
Seth mentions specifically that they are bringing the world of books and artistic endeavors to these young people for the very first time.
Which is huge.
It is. They are modeling a life where curiosity is the main driver, rather than just strict social convention. Seth even tells them, you have completely changed and broadened their conception of what adults are like.
That is such a heavy realization, though. I mean, imagine finding out that your casual Friday night hangouts are actually restructuring the entire worldview of your friends. It is a lot of pressure.
It creates a real tension.
Yeah.
And the notes from the session actually reveal that Rob and Jane were feeling a bit drained by all of this.
Oh, really?
Yeah. They were getting bored with the casual visits. They felt like they were hosting a social club rather than doing their serious metaphysical work.
Yeah, I get that. Nobody wants to be the permanent entertainment committee for the neighborhood.
Yeah.
And this leads to some surprisingly practical advice from Seth.
It really does.
Because you would expect a disembodied spirit to say something like, oh, just love everyone, keep your door open, be an endless well of patience. But Seth is like, no, boundaries.
Exactly. Seth tells them, if your Friday get-togethers have become boring, it is to a large extent because you have both allowed them to do so.
Ouch, putting the blame right back on them.
He advises them to restructure the whole thing. He says, don't just hang out. Make it a monthly meeting specifically structured for answering questions and discussing the material.
He literally says this would not be a social affair. I love that so much. He is putting the hammer down. He is saying, if you are going to be teachers, then be teachers. Don't just be buddies who let people loiter in your living room and drink your beer.
And there is a profoundly deep lesson in honesty right there. Seth points out that the young friends subconsciously feel let down when Rob and Jane are just being polite in a social way.
I can feel the fakeness.
Yes. Seth says they are not hurt by honesty.
They are not hurt by honesty. Man, that is a quote to tape on your bathroom mirror.
It really is.
We spend so much of our time tiptoeing around people, right? Thinking we are being nice. But Seth argues that by diluting the interaction with social pleasantries, we are actually depriving people of the real value we can offer them.
It connects right back to that idea of teaching them to think. If you are pretending to be interested in small talk when you really want to discuss the nature of the universe.
You are teaching them that it's necessary to be fake.
Exactly. To be fake, to be polite. By setting a boundary, saying, we will meet once a month to discuss deep topics, you are modeling that your time and energy are highly valuable.
It is funny because we often associate being spiritual with being infinitely available. Like you have to be this glowing ball of pure acceptance and never say no. But Seth is essentially telling them to be strictly professional about their mentorship.
Yes, and that professionalism is actually a form of deep respect for the student. If you treat your own wisdom as something that deserves a scheduled time slot, the people receiving it will value it so much more. It is entirely about quality over quantity.
So speaking of time and energy, this segues perfectly into the next major theme of the session, lifestyle design. Or, as I like to call it, Seth's Guide to Not Living Like a Robot.
The very fitting title. Seth pivots from the visitors to how Rob and Jane structure their own private daily lives. And he is quite critical of their adherence to the standard 9-to-5, Monday through Friday mentality.
Which is so funny because Rob had a normal job, right? He was working in commercial art. But Seth is telling them to mentally break out of that specific cage.
Correct. Seth says, if possible, get away from the idea of weeknights and weekends, for this is hampering to some degree.
He is pushing for what he calls a flexible existence.
Yes. A flexible existence.
I feel like this is advice that was way, way ahead of its time. In 1966, that rigid structure was everything. You work, you come home, you watch TV, you sleep. Weekends are for mowing the lawn and doing chores. Seth is looking at this and saying, this is stifling your creativity.
He views their role not just as employees or homeowners, but as we established earlier, as teachers. And to be an effective teacher or an effective creator, you need a framework that is truly refreshing.
You can't pour from an empty cup.
Exactly. You cannot find inspiration if you are rigidly locked into a schedule that dictates exactly when you are allowed to be creative and exactly when you must be off.
He even gives them specific advice on how to break up the day. He tells Jane, or Rupert as he calls her during the sessions, to take a clear break in the middle of the afternoon. A walk, a snack. Just treat the day as a fluid resource, not a punch card.
It is about rhythm versus routine.
Oh, I like that.
Routine is something imposed from the outside. Rhythm comes from within. Seth is trying to get them to find their own natural rhythm. And this brings us to the most delightfully specific, mundane piece of advice in the entire session.
Oh, I know exactly where you were going with this. The grapefruit decree.
Grapefruit decree.
I laughed out loud when I was reading this part. Here we have this vast consciousness that can see across time and space, and he stops the profound metaphysical lecture to say, and I quote, grapefruit to be substituted for oranges.
It is fantastic. No elaborate explanation given in this specific snippet, just switch the citrus.
And he adds, I strongly suggest at least a short walk for you, Joseph, Daly, and Rupert as well.
It serves a dual purpose, really. First, it is highly likely valid health advice for their specific biological needs at that exact moment in time.
Sure, maybe they needed different vitamins.
But second, and I think more importantly, it serves to ground the entire experience. It reminds the listener, and it reminds Rob and Jane, that spiritual development does not happen in a void. It happens inside a physical body. You have to feed the body, and you have to move the body if you want the psychic antenna to work clearly.
That is such a great point. It is pretty hard to receive telepathic messages from Wyoming if you are scurvy-ridden and lethargic from sitting on the couch all day.
Precisely. The vessel absolutely matters. And speaking of the vessel receiving messages, let's move to the trippier side of this session. We have handled the domestic advice, so now we get into what I am calling consciousness hacking.
Yes. This is where the deep dive really lives. Seth drops a concept here that feels straight out of the movie Inception, but like 40 years early. He talks about merging the dreaming self with the waking self.
He does. He says, I am still waiting for the day when you become aware of your own dreams while you are awake and conscious at the same time, fully, of your physical environment.
Dreaming while awake. Now, usually when we hear that phrase, we just think of daydreaming, staring out the window, or maybe even hallucinating. But Seth means something very specific and very controlled here, doesn't he?
He does. He is describing a state of dual awareness.
Dual awareness.
Usually, our human focus is entirely singular. We are either fully focused on the physical world because we are awake, or we are focused on the inner world because we are asleep and dreaming. Seth is challenging them to widen the lens.
To keep one eye on the street and one eye on the internal monitor.
Yes. Rob actually has a really cool note about this in the session transcript. He talks about his practice of hatha yoga.
Oh, right, the yoga experiment.
He says that after doing his physical routine, he lays down and drifts into this state where he sees images and hears voices, but he knows with absolute certainty that he is still lying on the floor in his house in Elmira.
So it is like lucid dreaming, but in reverse.
How do you mean?
Well, in lucid dreaming, you wake up inside the dream. You realize you're dreaming while you were asleep, but here, you are bringing the dream out into the waking room with you.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. Rob describes it as a passive state. He is seeing hypnagogic images, you know, those little flashes of light or random scenes you get right before you fall asleep.
Yeah, I get those all the time.
But instead of letting himself fall asleep, he tries to hold that state while remaining completely conscious of the room.
And Seth explains why this actually matters. He says, telepathically you receive thoughts when you are not trying to receive them. He is suggesting that this background noise, the stuff we usually just filter out so we can focus on driving a car, cooking dinner, is it actually full of raw data.
That is the big realization here. We tend to think of telepathy or psychic ability as this superpower that you have to actively turn on, like flipping a switch in your brain.
Right, like concentrating really hard until your nose bleeds.
But Seth is saying, no, the radio is always on. It is always broadcasting. You are just ignoring the music because you are too focused on the traffic in front of you.
We are conditioned to ignore that inner data. We just write it off as our imagination or random noise. But Seth is teaching them to pay attention to the periphery of their awareness.
And this isn't just a theoretical exercise for them. They actually put this concept to the test with what we are calling the Wyoming remote viewing experiment.
Oh man, this is the X-Files segment. We need the spooky synthesizer music for this part.
We do.
So let me give some context for everyone. Rob had previously tried to just tune in to a random target. He had this sudden vision of a group of people out in Wyoming, which is completely random. Why Wyoming? Who knows? But he tried it. And in this session, Seth comes through with the receipts.
He does. And the specificity of the data is actually quite chilling. Seth validates that Rob did, in fact, connect with a real group. He says it is a small group.
Let's actually list the data hits naturally because it is wild how specific it gets. Number one, Seth says it is a small group, about 5 to 7 people.
Right, not some massive national organization, just an informal gathering.
Number two, he gives location details. He says there are mines nearby.
Number 3, he mentions high hills or mountains to the northwest.
Number 4, he drops specific numbers. He says the number 91, maybe like a highway or road number.
And the number 103.
Number 5, a strong connection with the word salt.
And finally, he mentions Indians. He says the image of an Indian is a symbol that is used there.
What is so fascinating to me here is not just that Seth is giving these concrete facts, but he actually stops to explain how the information is coming through Jane.
Yes, the mechanics of it.
Because Jane, the medium, was apparently getting really anxious about getting the proper names wrong. Seth says, "You see, we are trying to speak around the word we want."
Speak around the word. That is such a profound insight into how channeling actually functions.
It is like playing a game of cosmic charades. Seth cannot just shove the literal word Cheyenne into Jane's brain if her conscious mind is blocking it out of anxiety, so he sends related images instead. Salt, Indians, hills, mines.
He relies heavily on word association and symbolism. It implies that telepathy is not like sending a clear text message. It is much more like sending a collage of feelings and symbols that the receiver then has to interpret and decode.
It really makes you wonder how much data we miss in our own daily lives because we are constantly looking for a literal billboard with instructions, and the universe is sending us, I don't know, a picture of a grapefruit.
It is very likely we miss a lot. We demand strict literalism, but the inner self speaks almost entirely in poetry and symbol.
And you know, if we look at those specific hits from Rob, the 91, the Salt, the Indians, it is amazing because Rob was likely just letting his mind drift when he picked that up. He wasn't forcing it at all. He was in that dreaming while awake state.
Precisely. He was accessing the data stream without any judgment. He didn't stop and say, wait, why am I thinking about salt right now? That makes no logical sense. He just let the impression of salt be there.
But speaking of demanding literalism and forcing things, let's pivot to the absolute funniest part of this session, the comedy of errors.
Ah, yes.
The case of the missing Ouija pointer.
This is truly the highlight of the session for me, just because of the sheer humanity of the situation.
So catch everyone up. What exactly is the crisis here?
The crisis is a lost plastic toy. Rob and Jane have a Ouija board that technically belongs to their landlord, Jimmy.
Right.
Now, they haven't used this board in over 2 years because Jane just speaks the messages directly now. But they lost the planchette, the little plastic pointer thing that goes on the board.
And Jenny wants it back?
Jimmy wants it back. He came over specifically to ask for his board. They looked everywhere in the apartment. Couldn't find it. Immediate embarrassment ensues.
So naturally, they do what anyone with a direct line to a multidimensional entity would do in a panic. They ask Seth. They're like, hey, omniscient spirit guide, where is our plastic triangle?
And the contrast is just so stark.
Mm.
Moments ago, Seth was describing the topography of Wyoming and the deep nature of conscious dreaming. Now he's trying to navigate their messy apartment.
And he is struggling. That is the funny part. He is really struggling to find it.
He is. He gives these very vague, halting clues.
Like what? Let's list those out, too. First clue.
He says there is a connection with magazines or papers.
Second clue. He says, look on top of your filing cabinet.
Third clue, it is in a dark rather than bright place.
And finally, try your back porch. I mean, it is basically like playing hot or cold with a ghost. But why is it so hard for him? Why can this entity clearly see a specific mine in Wyoming, but not a plastic pointer sitting on the back porch?
Seth explicitly tells them why it is so difficult. He says, you have both been so consciously concerned with your Ouija board pointer that it is difficult for me now to get much information through.
Conscious demands inhibit inner information.
Exactly. They are stressed out. They are embarrassed about losing Jimmy's stuff. Their conscious minds are screaming, where is it? Where is it? We need to find it right now.
Which creates static.
Massive static. When Rob looked at Wyoming, he was completely relaxed, just curious, totally unattached to the outcome. The channel was wide open. With a pointer, the channel is completely clogged with anxiety and urgency.
That is a massive lesson for anyone trying to use their intuition. If you want the answer too badly, if you are completely freaking out about the outcome, you block your own signal.
Is the Zen of lost keys.
The Zen of lost keys, yes.
You only ever find them when you finally stop looking and just relax. Seth is demonstrating that fundamental principle in real time.
I also love that Seth notes the irony of the situation. He basically says, look, I am trying to help you guys out, but you are making this really hard for me.
And he even adds a disclaimer. He says he is only certain of the low impression and the papers. He is actively hedging his bets. Even a multidimensional spirit guide does not want to be wrong about the location of a lost household item.
It is just so humanizing. It reminds you that this Seth personality, whatever it truly is, has a distinct sense of humor and a very real limit to his patience with their clutter.
It completely changes the dynamic from master and students to almost roommates.
Yeah.
One roommate just happens to be non-physical and incredibly wise.
Right. It's like, I can explain the profound secrets of the universe to you, but I simply cannot help you if you refuse to organize your old magazines.
A very fair trade-off, I think.
Okay, before we wrap up the analysis of the session, there is one more quick segment that touches on the hard science of the time. The Dr. In-Stream experiment and the quasars.
Yes, this is a quick-fire round of ESP testing they were doing for a researcher named Dr. Instream. Seth gives these rapid impressions of target objects.
So the hits here are a minnow, a button that looks kind of like a coin with symbols on it, and a snake shape.
And he also mentions a very specific sound, osis.
Rob hears that and immediately thinks of Isis, the Egyptian goddess. But Seth corrects him and says, no, not quite. It just shows the auditory nature of how the connection sometimes works.
But the part of this segment that really struck me was the discussion about quasars.
Right, because Rob really wants to ask Seth about them. Quasars were massive news in 1966. Time magazine had just done a huge article on them. They were these newly discovered, mysterious, super bright objects at the very edge of the universe.
Rob's absolutely dying to ask. He is the ultimate cosmic encyclopedia on the line. But he makes a choice. He doesn't ask.
Why does he hold back?
Because Jane is tired. The session has been running long. Rob notices her physical energy is flagging. He describes the feeling in his notes. He says it was like having a book before you that you were very interested in, yet you didn't open the cover.
That is such a tender moment between them. It really shows the deep love there. He prioritizes his wife's physical well-being over discovering the secrets of the cosmos.
It is touching. And it also reinforces the physical reality of mediumship. It is literal labor. It burns calories. It takes a massive amount of physical energy from Jane. Seth acknowledges this too.
What does he say?
He says, if it were not for the labor involved on your part, Joseph, I would speak to you both more often.
It is a job. A very weird, very profound job, but a job nonetheless.
And that brings us right back full circle to the very beginning of our discussion today, the integration of the weird and the wonderfully normal.
So let's zoom out for a second. What does all of this actually mean for us today? If you are listening to this right now, we aren't in Elmira in 1966. We might not be channeling spirits in our living rooms, but there is something in session 246 that really sticks.
For me, the core takeaway is definitely the concept of the flexible existence. We live in a modern world that is even more rigid, more scheduled, and far more demanding than anything they experienced in 1966.
Oh, without a doubt. We have constant notifications, shared calendars, 24/7 news cycles.
We are optimized to death.
We really are. And Seth's invitation to break that weeknight versus weekend mindset is a profound invitation to reclaim your own time. To realize that your creative self, your spiritual self, does not operate on a corporate clock. You have to carve out those pockets of refreshing framework, or you just wither away.
And the other big takeaway for me is the passive influence we have on others, that accidental mentor dynamic. You don't have to have a massive platform or a book deal to influence people's lives. You just have to be interesting. You have to be authentic.
You are teaching them to think. If you can do that for even one single person, just by being yourself, by sharing the books you love, by eating your grapefruit and taking your daily walks, you are doing the work. You are actively changing the frequency of your environment.
And you don't even have to be perfect at it. You can be a profound spiritual teacher and still lose your Ouija pointer on the back porch.
In fact, losing the pointer might actually be part of the lesson.
It keeps you incredibly humble.
Absolutely. Okay, before we go, I want to circle back to that visualization Seth suggested. The dreaming while awake concept.
Yes. Let's give everyone listening a little bit of homework for today.
I love that.
As you go about your day-to-day, just try it. Don't close your eyes. Keep them wide open. Look at the physical world around you. But soften your mental focus just a bit. Listen to the background noise in your head.
Ask yourself, are you just seeing the traffic? Or are you picking up on the minnow, the salt, the feelings and symbols that maybe don't even belong to you?
Seth says we are doing it all the time anyway. We just need to stop aggressively ignoring it.
I love that so much. All right, everyone, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the archives. A quick reminder again, all of this incredible material is from session 246 of the early sessions, book 6.
Which is published by the New Awareness Network.
Please go visit sethcenter.com/early-sessions. Support the work they do, buy the books, get the full download because there's so much more in there.
And remember, this deep dive is produced for educational purposes and is distributed freely. Share it with a friend who might need a little bit of magic in their day-to-day.
We will leave you with this final provocative thought. You are walking through a dream right now. The only question is, are you lucid?
Until next time.
Stay curious.